Suppressing fire! Suppressing fire! You got yourself, follow it!
Fire and maneuver. These three words are the foundation of ground combat tactics. Fire without maneuver is a waste of ammunition. Maneuver without fire is a waste of lives. Only through covering fire can maneuvers be made in the face of the enemy, and only through maneuvers can the enemy be decisively defeated. This episode will explain fire and maneuver tactics using the infantry squad of the Second World War as an example. It will do so by answering three questions. Why does the tactic work? This part explores the history of fire and maneuver tactics up to the Second World War and delves into the theory behind its success. Who carried out the tactic? The infantry squad was the smallest unit that could perform fire and maneuver tactics on its own. This ability is explained through an examination of its armament and organization. How was the tactic used? This part centers on a detailed recreation of a British training exercise that shows a squad in the attack, using fire and maneuver to take an enemy position. You're watching Digital Battlefield Tours, and this is Teaching Tactics. The first question to answer is also the most important one. Why does this tactic work? Why is fire alone not enough to eliminate the enemy? Or why not move without the fire? Answering this question requires two steps. First, a look at the evolution of fire and maneuver throughout military history. Secondly, a step-by-step analysis of the inner workings of fire and maneuver. Taking a step back in time, we see that the use of projectiles to distract or demoralize, to injure or incapacitate, is as old as war itself. The earliest forms of combined arms warfare included ranged weapons, such as bows or slings, to open the way for decisive hand-to-hand combat. Even after the introduction of firearms, their fire served mainly to facilitate a decisive clash of steel. Pikes, swords and other close combat weapons remained a mandatory part of the early modern combined arms toolkit, besides the musket. Without them there would be no shock, no decision, only harassing fire. The pike finally disappeared from the battlefield, not because the firepower of the musket made it redundant, but because a way was found to turn the musket into a pike, the bayonet. For centuries, the sharp steel on the end of the musket was as important as the lead ball it fired. A dictating factor in pre-industrial warfare was the limited lethality of early firearms. Their range was short, accuracy within this range poor, and rate of fire low. Making the most out of limited firepower required numbers, which is why these weapons were fired from dense formations in ordered volleys. Even then, the shallow killing fields of these weapons could be overwhelmed by large numbers of attackers charging to bayonet range. Limited firepower meant offensive mass could defeat defensive fire. Limited firepower also kept battlefields small, meaning the fire and maneuver elements stayed within visual range of each other, thus simplifying coordination between them. The fire elements knew when to start and stop firing because they could observe the progress of the maneuver elements. The logic of limited firepower favored mass, which led to the use of fire and maneuver on a large, tightly coordinated scale. Concentrated batteries of artillery provided the fire, columns of infantry the maneuver. This logic changed in the industrial age. In the last decades of the 19th century, firepower increased exponentially. New weaponry, such as high explosive artillery, machine guns and magazine rifles, increased combat ranges and lethality. Units had to disperse to survive. As a result, battlefields became wider, deeper and seemingly empty, as both sides dug into the earth for protection. When the First World War made the impact of industrial firepower clear for all to see, it brought about a fundamental change in tactics. The armies that went into the Great War still practiced fire and maneuver from the musket age. Centralized artillery would provide the fire element, and the infantry followed on in a wave, conquering with the bayonet what had been cleared by the artillery, or so it was hoped. This presumption was reflected in the small unit organization of 1914. There were no dedicated fire elements below battalion level, and even there it was only a handful of machine guns. The rifle companies of the battalion, hundreds of men, were precisely that, riflemen and nothing else. The infantry of 1914 was a lightly armed maneuver element tied to a static fire element, the artillery. Infantry had no portable firepower of their own to carry on the attack with. The results were the bloody, failed attacks that came to define the Great War. The artillery tried to clear a path, but the dispersed and dug-in defenders survived the barrage and emerged to fire on the advancing infantry. Static firepower tore the attackers to shreds, while they lacked the portable firepower to respond in kind. The old-school fire and maneuver elements, the artillery and the infantry, were simply too far apart to work together on the dispersed modern battlefield. The solution was to downscale fire and maneuver, to give small infantry units their own fire element. In the course of the war, fire support weapons became lighter and were fielded at increasingly lower levels. At first battalions, then companies and platoons, were reorganized to contain their own specialized fire elements to support their own maneuver elements. New weapons, such as light machine guns, automatic rifles, grenade launchers and trench mortars, were developed to give these small units the portable firepower they needed. In the course of the war, the infantry went from a mass of plain riflemen to small collections of specialists, such as machine gunners, grenadiers and stormtroopers. By the end of the First World War, the infantry had evolved from a wave of riflemen following on the heels of artillery fire to small autonomous groups, capable of suppressing and outmaneuvering their opposition with the firepower they carried with them. This dispersion into smaller units increased their survivability in the face of modern firepower and made tactics more flexible. Industrial firepower changed the logic of fire and maneuver away from large, tightly coordinated formations and towards a flexible dispersion of autonomous units. The smallest of these was the infantry squad of around 10 men, which had become a common tactical organization by the Second World War and brings us to the subject of this episode: fire and maneuver at the squad level. Moving on from the history to the theoretical underpinnings of fire and maneuver, its inner workings can be explained through the following points. Fire alone cannot eliminate the enemy. Maneuvers are needed to eliminate the enemy. Maneuvers cannot be made under effective enemy fire. Enemy fire can be made ineffective by your own fire. Meaning, fire cannot eliminate the enemy, but it makes maneuvers possible that can. Starting with the first point, fire alone cannot eliminate the enemy. This doesn't mean that getting hit isn't lethal. What it means is that getting hit is comparatively rare. The majority of potentially deadly projectiles, be they bullets or fragments, will not hit their target. There are a few important reasons for this, and most come down to human factors. The first has to do with the target that the enemy will present. In war, the target is human, and chiefly concerned with his own survival. The enemy will do everything in his power to make himself a hard target to see and even harder to hit. Only a small part of the body needs to be exposed to fire a weapon, and even less to observe. By digging in, making good use of the terrain, shadows and camouflage, the enemy can make himself a tiny hidden target. His life is on the line, so he is extremely motivated to do so. Should his position be discovered and brought under effective fire, the enemy can retreat completely behind cover, making him immune to most fire. The second point has to do with the quality of the fire, which is also heavily subjected to human influences. Generally speaking, marksmanship under combat conditions is extremely poor. Even under the best of conditions, just hitting the enemy is difficult. He is mostly in cover, and the little he exposes of himself is camouflaged. Distance plays an important role too. Most small arms combat takes place within a few hundred meters. Distance makes the enemy an even harder target to hit, and adds ballistics to the equation. Hitting a target at range requires an accurate estimation of the distance, correct setting of the sights, and observation of where the shots land, so they can be adjusted on target. Especially this last part is made difficult in the field, as the concealment of an enemy position will often obscure bullet impacts. Taking into account poor visibility conditions, such as mist, rain or night, complicates this even further. But the biggest factor that ruins combat marksmanship is by far the stress that comes with life or death situations. Combat is a two-way shooting range, after all. You cannot fire at the enemy without exposing yourself to his fire. When taking a shot means risking life and limb, the quality of this shot will be severely affected. Tension leads to uncontrollable physical responses, such as muscle tremors, and mental, such as tunnel vision. The inescapable stress of combat severely limits the fine motor control and situational awareness that are prerequisites for good marksmanship. These factors help to explain the first point. Fire alone cannot eliminate the enemy. Under most combat conditions, small arms fire is too inaccurate and the defender too well protected for fire alone to be decisive. Context is important here. Fire can of course be very lethal depending on the circumstances. A column of infantry walking into a close-range ambush will suffer heavy losses, as will a unit caught in the open by artillery fire. The points made here are related to the case discussed. Small arms fire against a defender fighting from good natural cover or prepared positions. Perhaps the following quote from infantry training best summarizes this point. Remember that if the enemy is dug in, covering fire seldom kills him. It merely makes him keep his head down so that he is unable to shoot back. Knowing the limitations of fire leads us to the second point. Maneuver is needed to eliminate the enemy. A maneuver is movement with purpose. The purpose in this case to eliminate the enemy. The most reliable way to eliminate the enemy is at close quarters. This is called the assault. Fire alone proved ineffective at eliminating the defender because of his cover and the inaccuracy of the attacker's fire. The assault nullifies these factors by taking the fight to the enemy position. The advantage of a defensive position is that it protects the occupant while forcing the attacker to expose himself. By assaulting into the defender's position, these advantages are stripped away. The attacker and defender are now fighting on equal footing inside the position, but the attacker has the advantage of holding the initiative. He can use surprise and speed to overwhelm a confused and shocked defender. It is possible for an alert defender to continue the fight within the confines of his position, but he will no longer hold the advantage. He is trapped and cannot escape the volley of hand grenades the attacker is sure to use against him. More often, the defender will flee before facing the assault. A defender who has allowed the enemy to close to assaulting distance has already lost the fight, and will usually not wait for the bayonets to come to him. An escaped enemy, however, is one who fights another day. As the British Battle School puts it, object of the attack is not so much to capture ground as to exterminate all Huns holding the ground. This object will not be attained if they are allowed to retreat alive. The enemy retreat must be cut off if at all possible. Because the purpose of the maneuvers is to eliminate the enemy, he must not be allowed to retreat. This is why a successful assault must be covered by so-called extermination fire from the flank or rear. This requires additional maneuvers to properly set up, but once in position makes escape virtually impossible. The use of flanking to achieve surprise and thereby gain an overwhelming advantage is illustrated by the following quote from Battle School. Surprise is a nasty little packet of British infantry with a Tommy gun and a Bren gun who have whistled round the flank like lightning and are now pouring lead into the enemy's rear while he still has got his eyes glued on the place they came from. That is fine. It is excellent, if un-English, to shoot the enemy in the back. That is the best place to shoot them every time. If you think it out, that is the aim of all sound tactics. Murder without the loss of casualties yourself. To summarize this point, maneuvers are made to prepare the assault, and the assault is the final maneuver because it eliminates the enemy. The ideal end result is a broom and dustpan situation. The assault sweeps through the enemy position like a broom, driving the enemy into the extermination fire of the dustbin. Against such a perfect attack, the defender's only escape would be a timely surrender. However, actually performing any maneuvers is impossible because of the third point. Maneuvers cannot be made under effective enemy fire. This point is fairly straightforward. Moving means both leaving cover and ceasing fire, as accurate fire cannot be given on the move. This would suddenly make the enemy's fire a lot more lethal, as he now has an exposed target to shoot at without fear of return fire, a one-way shooting range. Certain techniques can make a maneuver under fire somewhat safer. Using a covered or concealed approach is a good start. Then, by alternating a crawl with a short rush, progress can be made without presenting an easy target. This can be done by small groups or individuals. By limiting the rush to a second or two, the enemy has no time to spot, aim and fire before the target disappears again. This is exhausting, however, and cohesion is quickly lost as men appear and disappear in the landscape, with some far forward and others straggling behind. The technique also loses its effectiveness as the distance to the enemy gets shorter. Individual movement techniques are therefore no solution to the third point. Maneuvers cannot be made under effective enemy fire. A way must be found to make maneuvers possible, and this brings us to the crucial next point. Enemy fire can be made ineffective by your own fire. This is where the key concept of suppressive fire or covering fire comes into play. As we know from point 1, fire alone cannot eliminate the enemy, but it can suppress him. Suppressive fire is not meant to do the improbable and actually hit the enemy. The intent is to saturate his position with so much fire that he no longer dares to shoot back for fear of getting hit by chance. One cannot fire on a two-way shooting range without exposing oneself after all. So what suppressive fire does is exploit the human instinct for self-preservation by making the cost of return fire so high that it is no longer worth it. Risking a shot at the enemy is a lot less sensible if 3 bullets just impacted around you and the 4th one is already on its way. General George Patton described the effect of suppressive fire as follows. The whistle of the bullets, the scream of the ricochet, and the dust, twigs and branches which are knocked from the ground and the trees have such an effect on the enemy that his small arms fire becomes negligible. What makes suppressive fire so effective is that the target doesn't know it's suppressive fire. When bullets are striking to the left and right of you, passing just over your head, it is natural to assume they are aimed directly at you. You think you have been discovered and the enemy is actively shooting at you, tracking your every move. You feel as if every passing round missed you through sheer luck, while in reality those rounds were never aimed at you. The enemy fired at the trees around you or at the edge of the trench you were in. They've probably never even seen you because you are safely behind cover. But that is exactly the point. You are now pinned to that cover. You are suppressed, without even having seen the enemy. The majority of ammunition spent in a fight is not aimed at an opponent, but this is not a waste. Fire is a tool. A tiny amount of it is a killing tool, but the vast majority is a tool that manipulates the enemy. It can suppress him, distract him, or make him disclose his position. The latter is called reconnaissance by fire. By searching probable enemy positions with fire, the enemy is tricked into thinking he has been discovered and will act accordingly. The following line from an American manual illustrates the application of suppressive fire well. Fire is not limited to points within the target known to contain an enemy. On the contrary, all men space their shots so that no portion of the target remains unhit. The side that successfully suppresses their opponent has won fire superiority. This means that enemy fire has been reduced to the point that it is now relatively safe to move out of cover. To quote the same American manual, fire superiority is gained by subjecting the enemy to fire of such accuracy and intensity that his fire becomes so inaccurate or so reduced in volume as to be ineffective. Once gained, it must be maintained. The gaining of fire superiority also signals the conclusion of the 4th point. Enemy fire can be made ineffective by your own fire. This leads to the final concluding point. Fire cannot eliminate the enemy, but it makes maneuvers possible that can. The conclusion is that while fire on its own doesn't win the engagement, neither does maneuver on its own. The key word in fire and maneuver is neither fire nor maneuver. It is the and that connects the two. For it is the mutually supporting combination of both fire and maneuver that makes the tactic work. Fire without maneuver is a waste of ammunition, and maneuver without fire is a waste of lives. The way fire and maneuver are connected in practice is in the form of so-called bounds. A bound is a maneuver covered by fire. By its nature, it requires 2 components, a fire element and a maneuver element. The fire element maintains fire superiority. It does so from a stationary covered position, the base of fire. The maneuver element then makes their move. They must avoid running through the fire of the covering element, but also take care not to advance too far, to the point that they are no longer covered by their fire. In an ideal scenario, the objective can be reached in a single cohesive bound, but this is rarely the case. The farther the maneuver element moves, the less effective the covering fire of the fire element becomes. But even if distance is no issue, there is still the desire to position the fire element in the rear of the enemy, to cut off his line of retreat. So a new bound must be made. This time the goal is to get the fire element forward. To do this, the two elements must switch roles. The maneuver element finds a covered position from where it can provide a base of fire, and the previous fire element now gets up and rushes forward. Once they overtake the current fire element and are at the edge of their field of fire, they become the new fire element and the roles reverse again. This alternate firing and moving is continued until favorable positions for the assault are occupied. This advancing in bounds through alternate firing and moving, also called leapfrogging, is the essence of small unit fire and maneuver. A good way of visualizing bounds is to compare it to walking. One foot is always on the ground, providing covering fire, while the other foot is in the air, making a move. You cannot walk with both feet on the ground, nor with both feet in the air. The same is true for combat. Fire without maneuver is a waste of ammunition, and maneuver without fire is a waste of lives. As the British infantry training puts it, one group must always be either firing or down in a position from which fire can be instantly opened. Always have one leg on the ground. As a final note on this subject, the use of fire and maneuver tactics typically leads to an attack that can be divided in 3 phases. The first phase is the firefight. This encompasses the first exchange of fire up to the gaining of fire superiority. This is a firefight in the literal sense. Both sides are fighting fire with fire. The side with the greater volume and accuracy of fire will usually win the firefight and gain fire superiority. Fire superiority then opens the way for the next phase, the maneuvers. Using bounds, the attacker maintains fire superiority while closing with the enemy. The end goal is to eliminate the enemy, which is usually done through an assault. So creating a suitable situation for the assault is therefore the main goal of the maneuvers. The assault is the final decisive phase. Assaults usually take the form of a broom and dustpan. An assault element enters the position using speed and surprise, while a covering element prevents enemy escape. These 3 phases will return in the final part of this episode. First, however, a look at the organization and armament needed to perform fire and maneuver at the squad level. Part 1 showed that fire and maneuver was a complex tactic that required strict coordination between specialized fire and maneuver elements. This second part will delve deeper into the kind of organization and armament that made fire and maneuver possible. This is the who question. Who carried out the tactic? Fire and maneuver could be performed on many different levels with many different weapons. As discussed in the beginning of part 1, artillery was the traditional fire element, and infantry the maneuver element. As firepower increased and battlefields became larger, the infantry could no longer rely on artillery support and had to create its own fire element. It did so using light machine guns, rifle grenades and other portable weapons, and fielded these at increasingly smaller levels. That brings us to the subject of this episode, the infantry squad, the smallest unit that was trained and equipped to perform fire and maneuver on its own. By the time of the Second World War, the squad had become a universally adopted tactical unit. While organization differed depending on specialization or nationality, some general characteristics of the squad stand out. The squad needed to be large enough to have a tactical impact on its own, while also being small enough that it could be led by a single person. This meant the average squad size was around 10 men. A common armament was a single light machine gun, with the rest of the men using a standard service rifle. The squad leader often had a submachine gun for both personal defense and close quarter fighting. The squad's capacity for fire and maneuver tactics is best reflected in its organization. A common layout was to use 2 groups, one small fire group that operated the light machine gun, and a larger maneuver group equipped for close combat. In part 3 we will discuss a British fire and maneuver drill. So to answer the who question, We will now look at the British and Commonwealth version of the infantry squad, the rifle section. While the name is different, the tactical role of the British section was identical to that of the better known American squad. A British rifle section of 1944 consisted of 10 men and carried 3 different small arms, 1 Bren light machine gun, 1 Sten submachine gun, and 8 Lee Enfield pattern bolt-action rifles. It was usually led by a corporal, with a lance corporal as second in command. Fire and maneuver tactics were fundamental to the section. As stated in battle school, every section is designed to provide its own covering fire within itself. It can, if necessary, rely on itself to get forward. This is the primary task of the Bren gun in the attack, to get the rifleman on. To do so, it was organized in 2 groups. The Bren group of 3 men with the light machine gun was the specialized fire element. The rifle group with the remaining 7 men, the maneuver element. Starting with the rifle group, this was the larger of the 2, consisting of the section commander and 6 riflemen. Despite its size, its firepower was fairly limited. The rifleman carried a bolt-action rifle, which was slow to fire. It held 10 rounds in an internal magazine, but required every round to be manually chambered. This not only reduced its mechanical rate of fire, but also made it heavily dependent on the skill of the user. The commander carried a Sten machine carbine, also known as a submachine gun. The light and handy Sten was a fully automatic weapon that fired pistol cartridges. It was ideally suited for close combat, and consequently very poor at longer ranges. In the hands of the section commander, it served the dual purpose of being both a personal defense weapon and a specialized assault weapon. The purpose of the rifle group was to close with the enemy in the final assault. To get there, they would need to bound forward with the Bren group using fire and maneuver. As the Bren group moved, the rifle group provided cover by concentrating the fire of their 6 rifles. While the firepower of the Lee Enfield was limited by its manual bolt cycle, a skilled user could still achieve an impressive rate of fire compared to other bolt-action rifles of its time, enough to maintain fire superiority while the Bren group repositioned. Once in an assault position, the rifle group would use shock and numbers to overwhelm the defender. A crucial weapon for this task was the hand grenade. These could be carried by all riflemen or by 1 or 2 riflemen designated as so-called grenadiers. The section commander would usually lead the assault, making the most of his short-range Sten gun. For close combat, the riflemen were trained in so-called snap shooting, walking fire from the hip or shoulder. The other part of the section was the Bren group. A gunner and assistant gunner operated the Bren gun, while the section's second in command would lead the group. Despite being the smaller of the 2 groups, it possessed the majority of the section's firepower, thanks to their Bren gun. Looking back at part 1, we know that firepower was crucial. The rapid gaining and maintaining of fire superiority through an accurate, high volume of fire had to be established before any other actions could be taken. For the infantry section, the Bren light machine gun made this possible. The importance of light machine guns for small unit tactics warrants a closer look at the technical side of this weapon. The origin of the light machine gun, or LMG for short, is closely connected to the firepower revolution discussed in part 1. The original machine gun that dominated the battlefields of the First World War was a heavy design. It was often water-cooled, belt-fed and mounted on a heavy tripod. This meant it could fire near indefinitely, great for suppressive fire, but at the cost of poor mobility. Just like the artillery, they could support the opening of an attack, but once the infantry advanced, the heavy machine guns fell behind. What was needed was a way to carry the firepower of a machine gun forward with the advancing infantry, a light, portable machine gun. Design and production of LMGs advanced rapidly during the First World War, to the point that they became a familiar sight by the end of the war. By the start of the Second World War, a LMG at the squad level had become the norm for most armies. The British had been large-scale users of the Lewis light machine gun in the First World War, but adopted the Bren as its replacement just in time for the Second. Taking a closer look at the Bren gun, we can identify some of the features that made a LMG special. Its core design philosophy was to make the sustained firepower of a machine gun portable. To ensure sufficient firepower, 2 characteristics were carried over from the heavy machine guns. Firstly, it fired a rifle caliber cartridge, to ensure sufficient range and lethality. Secondly, a capacity for fully automatic fire, to overwhelm the enemy through volume of fire. All other features were altered in order to lighten the load. The first was the cooling. The part most susceptible to overheating is the barrel. Most heavy machine guns encased the barrel in a water jacket to keep it cool. This was very efficient, but also added a tremendous amount of weight and complexity to the weapon. An air-cooled barrel was much lighter, but once it got hot, it took a long time to cool down. A solution used by the Bren and other LMGs was to add a quick change mechanism to an air-cooled barrel. That way, a hot barrel could be swapped for a cold one. The Bren group carried 2 barrels, and the assistant gunner would change them every so often to let them cool down in turns. The Bren gun had one of the best quick change mechanisms of its time, allowing for barrel swaps in mere seconds. This allowed for sustained fire on par with water-cooled guns, but without the complexity and weight of water jackets and steam condensers. The second feature of a light machine gun is its ammunition feed. Most heavy machine guns used long, uninterrupted belts of hundreds of rounds. Great for sustained firepower, but awkward to load and carry. Most LMGs, including the Bren, used magazines instead. These were easy to carry and quick to load. They were also more resistant to dirt and used spring tension to reliably feed cartridges into the weapon. The Bren gun accepted its magazine from the top, which was designed so the assistant gunner could do it, while the gunner remained focused on the target. A magazine change like that took no longer than a second or 2. A final feature are the ergonomic improvements. A light machine gun was designed to be carried and fired by a single operator, not unlike a rifle. This often meant the inclusion of a shoulder stock, pistol grip and sling. Instead of a separate tripod, a light machine gun typically had its own integrated lightweight bipod. This gave the light machine gun a broad spectrum of use. It could be used stationary with the bipod, or be carried as an assault weapon, fired from the hip at close range. While a Bren could be carried and fired by just one operator, it was best used in a 3-man team. The gunner fired the weapon, and an assistant gunner helped with changing magazines, swapping barrels and clearing malfunctions. Working like this, reloads and barrel changes could be done so fast there would be no noticeable pause between bursts. They both ran the risk of target fixation, however, or could get distracted by the maintenance of the weapon. That's why a third man, the group commander, was needed. He monitored the position of the gun, its fire and ammunition consumption. Crucially, he coordinated the fire of the Bren with the movements of the rifle group, which we will see in more detail in part 3. The firepower of the Bren was so integral to the section that the majority of the ammunition it carried was reserved for it. 700 rounds were carried pre-packed in magazines especially for the Bren gun, while the total ammunition load for the section's 8 rifles only amounted to 400 rounds. In fact, every rifleman carried 2 spare magazines for the Bren gun in special pouches on his person, meaning he carried more ammunition for the Bren than for his own rifle. It should be noted that these were the same cartridge, so both weapons could fire it. Still, given the importance of the Bren, it would be more common for rifle-allocated ammunition to be given to the Bren than the other way around. That covers the organization of the British Rifle Section, its armament and its capability to perform fire and maneuver tactics. However, a very important closing remark is in order. It is something that haunts every discussion of tactics and organization, namely the difference between theory and practice. The organization discussed here was a paper organization. It was written down as the ideal organization to perform idealized tactics with. Reality is far from ideal, however. A first reality check is that a unit as small as a section would see extreme fluctuations in manpower and equipment. It would suffer losses, be reinforced, merged with another section, or detached for a special mission. Leaders and men would be lost and others would take their place. With people coming and going, it is hard to maintain the necessary group skills and teamwork to perform complex tactics. The Americans had a great deal of experience with manpower problems during the war, and they concluded that squad fire and movement is a refinement which cannot be applied in prolonged combat when the life expectancy of a trained squad is as short as we found it to be. A second point that ties into this is that a section rarely fought alone. A section was very much tied to its platoon, which consisted of 2 other sections and a headquarters led by an officer. This platoon was in turn reliant on its company for support and the company on the battalion and so on. A section acting on its own was rare, usually limited to patrols or outposts, not deliberate attacks or defenses. Taking these 2 points together leads to a more messy but realistic version of section fire and maneuver. Instead of a section fighting on its own using a neat subgroup structure, you would have multiple sections fighting closely together in a platoon or company action. One section's light machine gun would be covering a rush by some riflemen from another section, then an entire section makes a move covered by the other 2. A machine gunner might receive an order directly from the platoon commander instead of his section leader. By the time the platoon reaches its objective, all section and subgroup organization is gone. It's a handful of riflemen, a couple of light machine guns, and whoever is in charge to hold it all together. Yet they would still have used fire and maneuver tactics. Tactics facilitated in part by the organization and armament of the sections. So, while section tactics and organization were a lot more messy and confused than the manuals portray, the fact of the matter still is that most armies of the time organized and trained at the section level to perform fire and maneuver tactics. It was the principle of fire and maneuver that counted. The actual application of this principle could differ depending on circumstances, and often went beyond the capacity of a lone section. We will explore this gap between theory and practice further in the following part, which deals with the British battle drill for section in the attack. This third and final part will answer the how question. How was the tactic used? It will do so using a recreation of the British battle drill for section in the attack. This source has gained somewhat of a reputation, however, that must first be cleared up. This particular battle drill is frequently misused as an example of small unit tactics. This stems from a misunderstanding regarding its nature as a battle drill. What must be cleared up is that battle drills were not actual tactics. Instead, battle drills were a training method, intended to teach a basic understanding of combat through highly simplified and highly repetitive exercises. Real combat, and therefore real tactics, was anything but simple and anything but repetitive. Every engagement was different depending on terrain, forces and countless of other factors. Therefore, every tactic had to be different too. Battle drills did not set out to teach rigid tactics. Instead, they developed a tactical mindset. And they did this just like any other drill, through repetition. Drilling with a rifle creates muscle memory that allows a soldier to aim and fire instinctively. The battle drill set out to do the same with tactics, create familiarity through repetition. One of the major proponents of battle drill compared it to playing a sport for the first time. First, a set of techniques must be mastered. How to throw a ball or swing a bat, for example. Through these repetitive exercises, the necessary feeling is developed that allows the advanced player to depart from these techniques. Only through subconscious familiarity with the basics can the experience be gained that allows the advanced student to create his own techniques. Battle drills set out to teach combat tactics just like any other skill. First, combat was distilled into its bare essentials, simplifying it to the point of becoming idealized. The best techniques for dealing with these textbook situations were then refined into simple steps to be drilled again and again. Eventually, a familiarity was gained that allowed the more talented students to formulate their own tactics. If not, they could at least fall back on the drills as they were taught, which was better than nothing. Battle drills were first taught in theory using a map or sandbox. Then they were practiced on the parade ground, with the students shouting the different steps of the drill as they performed them. Next, special instruction units would demonstrate the drill in the field, using purpose-built practice courses. The students would then practice these field drills until proficient. Variations were introduced, such as fighting in built-up areas, woods or at night. Finally, live fire exercises were done, which the British called battle inoculation. Like a vaccine, this had the purpose of immunizing the troops to the noise and confusion of battle by first exposing them to it in a controlled environment. The purpose of battle drill as a training method ties back to a point made at the end of part 2, that sections rarely fought alone. The fact that the battle drill for section in the attack does show a lone section betrays its nature as an exercise. The section was used not because it was expected to perform these actions independently in the field, but because it was easier to instruct a section of 10 men than a platoon of 40. That is how the following drill should be seen, not as a realistic situation that would be encountered in the field, but as a purpose-built exercise that taught the basic principles of fire and maneuver. It is precisely because of this that the drill is such a suitable example for this episode. We are discussing the broad application of small unit fire and maneuver tactics here, so a drill that is designed to teach these fundamental principles fits perfectly. With that settled, we can move on to the drill itself. The following recreation is based on 3 versions of the drill. The first is found in Battle School from 1942. The second in Part 8 of Infantry Training, published in 1944. And finally its post-war replacement, Infantry Training Volume 4 from 1950. The general outline of this drill is fairly straightforward and reflects the simplified nature of the exercise. A single section at full strength is attacking on its own. The terrain is perfectly laid out for a flanking attack. The enemy occupies a small crop of trees in an open field, with a neat line of hedgerows enveloping their right flank and rear. Enemy strength is not detailed, but can't be more than a few riflemen without automatic weapons. The enemy is all alone, with no supporting positions securing their flanks. The actions to be taken by the friendly section are advance to contact, react to fire, gain fire superiority, perform bounding movements to a flank, assault the enemy position, and finally consolidate. These actions can be streamlined into the 3 phases discussed in Part 1, the firefight, the maneuvers, and the assault. The drill starts with an advance to contact. The section moves cross-country, avoiding roads that will likely be covered by enemy fire. Different formations can be adopted depending on the terrain. When advancing across open country against unknown contact, the section is best off using an arrowhead formation. The rifle group is in the lead in a wedge, the section commander forming the point. The Bren group follows in a small wedge of their own. A wedge formation allows for optimal observation and fire to the front and flanks, while also dispersing the men. Should the leading wedge come under fire, the Bren group is in a position to provide immediate support from the rear. Depending on the terrain, the section commander may decide to have the Bren group stay behind in cover while the rifle group crosses open ground, then linking up again once the rifles made it across. Alternatively, 2 riflemen may be sent forward to act as scouts, either to screen the advance of the main body or to investigate a landmark like a wood or farm. While this is certainly dangerous work, the enemy is less likely to fire on scouts, knowing they are not a lucrative target to reveal their position for. Regardless of formation, the principle remains that the entire unit must not be caught in the same burst of fire. Always have an element in the rear ready to support the leading element if it takes fire. In this drill, the section moves across the bottom field towards the southern line of hedgerows, when they come under effective enemy fire. An important distinction is made between effective and ineffective fire. As was discussed in Part 1, fire is a tool. The enemy may be firing to draw out a response. Perhaps they saw a glimpse of the lead scout and are trying to determine the size of his unit. They may be firing as a warning to other defensive positions or to cover their retreat. They may even be firing at another friendly unit they have spotted in the distance. Effective fire is fire aimed directly at you with the intent of eliminating or suppressing. This can be distinguished from ineffective fire by the sound it makes. A bullet flying past makes a loud snapping noise, like the cracking of a whip. The discharge of the weapon it came from is only heard later, as the sound travels slower than the supersonic bullet. When the fire is not directly aimed at you, you only hear the distant discharge. Knowing the difference is important. To quote the manual, the section will only go to cover if effective fire is brought to bear on them. They must never go to cover just because they hear the noise of fire directed at someone else. The best defense against sudden effective fire is the use of a formation discussed earlier and an anticipatory order from the section commander. A dispersed formation like an arrowhead lowers the chance of casualties by the initial burst and has an overwatching element that can quickly return fire. An anticipatory order, on the other hand, is given by the section commander to individuals or groups and is relevant to the immediate situation facing the section. Such an order ensures a speedy and cohesive reaction by everyone when they come under fire. The example order given in the manual is, if we come under fire across here, all run forward to that hedge. Should no such order be given when they come under fire, the men are trained to go down, crawl, observe, sights, fire, meaning they drop to the ground instantly, crawl to a firing position and return fire on their own initiative. This is better than nothing, but runs the risk of disorganizing the section, as the men disappear in the undergrowth and the noise of fire drowns out any commands. Becoming pinned down by the first volley of enemy fire is disastrous, as the section will be stuck in the enemy's kill zone. With or without an anticipatory order, the section must move to a suitable firing position, in this case the hedgerow at the northern end of the field. By rushing, crawling or leapfrogging, the section reaches the hedge. From here, the section commander can judge the terrain, the strength of the enemy, and formulate a plan accordingly. His first priority is to gain fire superiority. To quote the manual, "No advance is possible unless enemies' heads are kept down by weight of metal. Covering fire is essential to any advance. The first essential is gain fire superiority." The enemy position is pinpointed insofar as possible and the firepower of the section concentrated on it. Reconnaissance by fire is used to probe possible secondary positions. It may even prove necessary to move troops around to bait the enemy into firing. The section commander takes no part in the firing, but observes and adjusts the fire of a section if needed. Creative use of the Bren gun is encouraged. It can be moved around to confuse the enemy and make him think there are multiple sections attacking. Fire a few bursts from one position, then relocate and fire some single shots to mimic a rifle, then move again to fire a few automatic bursts. The firefight has been won when return fire becomes minimal and is wildly inaccurate. The initiative has been gained and must quickly be exploited by maneuvering against the enemy. This brings us to the second phase, the maneuvers. The goal of the maneuvers is to eliminate the enemy. This is achieved by an advance to his flank or rear, followed by an assault, the broom and dustpan discussed in part 1. Setting up this trap requires the Bren group to be in a position to deliver cutoff fire, and the rifle group to be in an assault position. Ideally, these positions intersect at a 90-degree angle. This allows the Bren to fire on the enemy position up to the very moment the riflemen charge in, without running the risk of shooting them in the back. Both of these positions are best placed in the flank or rear of the enemy. This cuts off reinforcements, severs his line of retreat, and generally causes panic. The manual places great emphasis on the demoralization caused by flanking fire, mentioning the immense psychological value of opening up fire from the rear or the back of a flank. The enemy thinks he is surrounded and either retires or surrenders. He is particularly liable to do this if the fire comes from an automatic weapon. Getting to these positions requires an advance using fire and maneuver, preferably along a covered flank. The drill is ideally set up for this, with an uninterrupted hedgerow running along the right flank and into the rear of the enemy position. The section commander explains the plan to his men, indicates the approach, the final position to be reached, and the bounce they will make to get there. Having given his orders, the section commander leaves the Bren group in the care of his second in command and leads the rifle group on the first bound. The Bren maintains fire superiority while the riflemen rush along the hedge. They must take care not to advance too far, as this will open up angles of fire for the defender that are not being covered by the Bren gun. Having reached the edge of the Bren's field of fire, the rifle group sets up to create a new base of fire. The riflemen pick up the fire, allowing the Bren group to get up and make their move. The Bren group follows in the footsteps of the rifle group and then bounce past them until they reach the edge of their protective fire. The Bren gun is set up and opens fire, signaling to the rifle group that it is once again their turn to move. These bounds are continued until both groups have reached their indicated positions. Coordinating these bounds is incredibly difficult, yet absolutely vital. If confusion were to set in, which it quickly does, you might end up with both groups firing and none moving, which is a waste of time and ammunition. Even worse is when both groups start moving at the same time. With no one firing, the hard-won fire superiority is lost and the enemy is given a one-way shooting range, just as moving troops are presenting an easy target. The manual gives a few pointers on how to stay in touch. Ideally, the section is so well trained and experienced that they develop an instinctual feeling for it. They know when to bound based on timing and the sights and sounds of battle. A more realistic method is to stay within voice range of each other. However, given the noise of battle, this would result in tiny bounds. Alternatively, a visual link can be maintained by having a member of each group keep an eye on the other, using hand signals to communicate. Another option is for the two groups to quickly link up as one bounds past the other. This opportunity can also be used to pass full magazines to the Bren group, as these are carried by the riflemen. One of the more interesting methods of communication is to use the firing of the Bren gun to tap a message. Firing single shots in a prearranged pattern can signal the beginning or end of a bound. If all else fails, a runner can be sent between the two groups as a last resort. The maneuvering phase is complete when the rifle group reaches its assault position and the Bren group its cutoff position. From here they can launch the final decisive phase, the assault. The assault seeks to do what fire alone has not yet accomplished: eliminate the enemy and take his position. It can only do so by closing with him, to hand grenade or even bayonet range. Still, the manual warns that the assault should not be an end in itself. Before the assault goes in, the enemy may be induced to surrender or forced to flee into the extermination fire of the Bren. An assault is an extremely dangerous action and should only be launched when necessary and well supported. Performing an assault consists of two steps. First, the enemy position must be reached. This is done like any of the previous bounds. The Bren covers and the riflemen advance. The second step is new. The Bren must cease fire to avoid hitting the riflemen, leaving them to fight within the enemy position unsupported. Both steps require tight coordination, both between groups and within them. The Bren must keep up a covering fire up to the moment the riflemen charge in. Ceasing fire too early will allow the enemy to recover, just as the riflemen are at their most vulnerable. Ceasing fire too late will take the momentum out of the assault or even cause friendly fire. According to the manual, the ideal is for the Bren gun to shoot you right onto and over your objective. Coordination is also vital for the rifle group. They must stick together and hit the enemy like a wave, not a trickle of individuals. To ensure cohesion, the section commander must personally lead the assault. As the riflemen fix their bayonets, load their magazines and ready their grenades, the section commander makes a final appreciation of the situation. The manual gives him a few options for the assault. The most straightforward one is to rush the entire rifle group forward in line formation, the section commander in the center with 3 riflemen on his flanks. This ensures concentration of force and optimal control for the commander, well suited for overwhelming a weak opponent. A viable alternative is to split the rifle group in 2, one group of 4 including the section commander and a group of 3 led by a senior rifleman. This formation is safer when facing strong opposition, as the two groups can leapfrog forward or envelop the enemy. A much more methodical approach is described in the 1942 edition of the drill. It calls for the rifle group to send 1 or more grenadiers and a sniper crawling to the enemy position under cover of the remaining riflemen and the Bren group. The task of the grenadiers is to throw fragmentation grenades into the enemy position, while the sniper provides immediate protection against enemy interference. Alternatively, the grenadier may throw smoke grenades into the position to blind the defenders against the coming assault. When using smoke, it must be placed directly on the enemy position, not between the enemy and the assaulting troops. This would also blind the attackers and silhouette them as they come through the screen. However, due to the unreliable nature of smoke and the fact that it hinders both sides, its use should be carefully considered. Smoke may serve a better purpose as a distraction, by placing it away from the direction of the assault. The remaining riflemen rush forward from the assault position as soon as the grenades go off or the smoke thickens. They move forward at the double, meaning a controlled run. The goal is to reach the enemy quickly and as a cohesive unit, so care is taken that everyone stays in formation, especially when encountering obstacles such as ditches or fences. This move is covered by the Bren group, whose fire lifts when the riflemen reach the enemy position. This signals the end of step 1, reaching the position, and the beginning of step 2, clearing it. If all went well, the rifle group has reached the position in a cohesive line, with the section commander in the center. That way, all 7 weapons can be brought to bear simultaneously when the enemy is encountered. Failing to keep formation will lead to a trickle of attackers, not the wave that is needed to overwhelm the defenders. As the rifle group charges in, they fire from the hip to maintain fire superiority now that the Bren has ceased fire. The enemy will now be met at short range, most likely still hiding from the covering fire at the bottom of entrenchments. He may be wounded, shell-shocked, or ready to fight to the end. This is not known. Regardless, the rifle group sweeps through the position without halting, firing on enemies as they are encountered. Rifles are held in the on guard position, meaning the muzzle is held level and the stock of the rifle is secured under the armpit. This position allows for quick use of the bayonet, as well as so-called snapshots at close range. Fire is preferable to the bayonet, although bayonets might still be used to deliver a final blow. The section commander's Sten submachine gun is in its element during the assault. This short-range weapon had little use during the previous phases, but is now a major asset in close-quarter fighting. If stubborn resistance is encountered, hand grenades are used, followed by a rush of attackers. The rifle group rapidly assaults through the enemy position and must not linger within the position itself. Instead, they press on some 50 yards to a point where they consolidate. Preparations to repulse an enemy counterattack are taken immediately. The Bren group moves up to join the riflemen and covers the consolidation. The section commander checks for casualties and redistributes ammunition. Enemy casualties are searched and prisoners, if taken, held under guard. At this point the drill was complete. The section has successfully captured the position using fire and maneuver. The section maintained its cohesion when it first came under fire, thanks to its use of a sensible formation and preliminary orders. It located the enemy position and gained fire superiority through coordinated fire and clever use of the Bren gun. The section commander read the terrain well and ordered an advance along the covered flank to the rear of the enemy. The section moved forward in coordinated bounds, keeping one leg on the ground as the next step was made. Finally, a well-supported assault was launched that eliminated the enemy and took his position. With the why, who and how questions answered, this final part will now provide some closing remarks. These concluding points are broadly applicable to fire and maneuver tactics, not just the squad level action previously discussed. The first lesson to take away is on the nature of firepower. Its inability to fully eliminate the enemy on its own, but also its ability to manipulate the enemy in a number of ways. As discussed in part 1, fire alone cannot eliminate the enemy. It can cause attrition, meaning some of the enemy are taken out of action or their equipment is damaged. Fire can also neutralize the enemy fire, suppressing it, and fire can pin the enemy in place, preventing his advance or retreat, but it cannot fully eliminate him under most circumstances. If the fire lifts, which it must eventually do, the enemy is still there, manning his position. He will be weakened by the fire, but if no maneuvers have been made against him while he was suppressed, then the tactical situation has not changed. The enemy is still where he was before the fire was opened. Taking the battle drill from part 3 as an example, if the British section had not made use of any maneuver against their opponent, but only relied on fire, then they would have never advanced beyond the first hedgerow. They would have continued pouring fire on the enemy, even after they won fire superiority, without changing the situation. They would have spent their entire ammunition supply shooting at an enemy that was already suppressed behind cover. Then, once out of ammo, they would find themselves in the exact same place they started, without having changed the tactical situation in their favor. But instead of trying to eliminate their opponent through fire alone, the section used it as a tool. They used it to suppress the enemy. Suppression made the enemy's fire ineffective, so the section could advance, and pinned the enemy in place, so he could be trapped and eliminated by assault. The suppressive fire, while seemingly just as wasteful, was actually extremely valuable, as it facilitated a maneuver that changed the tactical situation, more than fire alone could ever do. In the end, a section that used the fire as a tool to maneuver ends up using it to eliminate the enemy, while a section that sought to eliminate the enemy outright without maneuver only wasted their fire. By understanding firepower in this way, tactics but also arms design are seen in a different light. Effective firepower isn't necessarily about landing hits on target. It's just as much about saturating an area with fire, sustaining this fire, and applying it in such a way that it manipulates the enemy by suppressing, isolating, and demoralizing. This is why a light machine gun and not a sniper rifle became the backbone of the infantry squad. It is not precise, eliminating fire that wins an engagement, but maneuvers covered by sustained, suppressive fire. The second lesson is to take into account human factors when studying tactics. This episode has been very focused on the theoretical side of tactics, its logic, organization, equipment, and training. Yet actual combat is very different from the cool, calculated theory. It is emotional, human business. Combat at the small unit level especially is as much dictated by morale and instinct as it is by technology and pre-battle planning. And it's only by taking into account the human factor that fire and maneuver starts to make sense. Its entire logic is based on human self-preservation. Suppression works because people rightly fear incoming fire, the close brush with death that a passing bullet impresses upon them. When put under such life-threatening pressure, most people will instinctually seek the protection of cover, even if it means ceasing fire and thus losing the firefight. Such is the two-way shooting range. The same is true for maneuvers. Most people will not get up and charge into gunfire. They are risk-averse. Only when enemy fire is suppressed will they gain the confidence to move out of cover. Fire and maneuver would not work in a war between robots. They would not fear fire, meaning they could not be suppressed nor pinned in place. The quality of their fire would not be diminished by muscle tremors or tunnel vision. Only outright destruction would stop them. This is not true for mortal man. He can be defeated by fear, desperation, and panic, the breaking of the will to fight at that place and time. It is not even necessary to inflict overwhelming casualties to cause this. Simply surprising the enemy, confronting him at a time or place or in a way he was not expecting, can have a greater effect than inflicting losses. This too we see in fire and maneuver in the form of the assault, the sudden confrontation between a suppressed, isolated defender and a surge of confident attackers. A successful assault relies on the determination and speed born out of the confidence of the attacker more than his numbers, and it is the primal fear and desperation of the defender that makes him flee or surrender rather than fight it out in close combat. More than any other part of the engagement, it is the decisive final assault that puts mind over matter. The defender could inflict heavy losses on an assaulting attacker or even repulse him, but that is thinking logically. Everything leading up to the assault, the suppressive fire, the flanking, have made sure the enemy is no longer thinking logically by the time the assault hits him. Finally, it should be noted that fire and maneuver was applied along a broad spectrum. This episode focused mostly on the squad level, primarily because its small size made it easier to explain and visualize. Fire and maneuver, however, was much more broadly applicable. Just 2 riflemen could perform fire and maneuver between them, as could 2 tanks. 2 squads can leapfrog together, or a squad and a machine gun team. An entire infantry company of over 100 men can maneuver under the protective fire of an artillery battery, or under the fire of a platoon of 5 tanks. This tank platoon in turn can transition from a fire element to a maneuver element, were another tank platoon or artillery to cover them. Even airstrikes can be the fire that covers a maneuver. Similarly, the situations in which fire and maneuver could be applied also varied greatly. This episode focused on the attack, but its logic was just as sound in other types of combat. In the defense, for example, the defender must maintain fire superiority, thereby denying the attacker the freedom to maneuver. For a retreat, fire superiority must be maintained while units leapfrog backwards, away from the enemy. Even just the limited case discussed in this episode, the squad in the attack, was compiled from multiple sources of different armies and time periods to arrive at a holistic picture. This broad approach and the resulting length of this episode was necessary due to the fundamental importance fire and maneuver has for this series. As the other episodes of Teaching Tactics will show, most combat was an application of the principles of fire and maneuver to the situation at hand with the forces available. The underlying logic remained largely the same, and it is this episode that has laid that foundation for the rest of the series.